the horse isn't responding to the aid, he's removing it. He's not trying to do the right thing or to help anyone out. He's just trying to find out, what can I do so that it stops? So it's the removal of the aid that's so important. And if all riders could just understand that basic principle. Hi everybody, continuing on this series of videos, and today I'm going to talk about a really interesting subject. It's the use of pressure. A lot of riders think that they know how to use their, as we call them here in Europe, their equestrian aids correctly. But a lot of people run into a bit of trouble because they're using the pressures to get responses, but they're not using the release to teach the responses. So I'll just repeat that. They're using the pressures to obtain different responses. Use pressure to turn right, use pressure to turn left, use pressure to slow down. But they haven't gone through the pressure release phase to teach the horse how to respond to those pressures. And that's leading to a bit of confusion and horses running into trouble. So we'll talk a little bit about that now. And pressure, usually whatever we're doing with a horse, whether it's using the halter or whether it's riding using your legs or whether it's with your hands that might apply pressure in the horse's mouth or whatever you've got on the horse's head, all those different things, that they depend on an understanding of negative reinforcement. Negative being the subtraction of pressure, the removal of pressure. The horse learns through trial and error. There is a pressure, it's uncomfortable, now I need to find a solution so that that pressure goes away. When the horse, through trial and error, tests the good response, the pressure is removed, and the horse learns through that process, through operant conditioning, how to remove different pressures. He learns to respond to those pressures. Those pressures can then be subsequently removed, reduced to very, very light versions of themselves. So pretty soon we can go from the operant conditioning into the Pavlovian conditioning, and now just really light signals are getting the responses. Now, I'm using a bit of science, a few scientific terms in all of this, because I think it's really important that we understand that science. I know for myself, I've did horsemanship for years, I've worked with the best, and once I had a more scientific understanding of what was really going on, suddenly things got much better. Now, I recently had an interesting experience. I found a box of old video cassettes that go back into the 80s of me working with horses, all sorts of different horses in all sorts of different countries. And I was watching those, and I had some of my students with me, and we were sitting there watching these cassettes, and I thought, wow, you know, I sure could have taught that kid a few lessons if I could have him today, being that he was me back then. And I was getting a few things, I was interpreting a few things wrong just because I didn't understand the science that I understand today. Sometimes taking things personally, sometimes getting into a bit of conflict with a horse, sometimes thinking that the horse was being disrespectful when he was just confused and not understanding, because, you know, I didn't know that at that time that the horse had no concept of right and wrong and good and bad, and he couldn't possibly be doing anything wrong because he doesn't know what it is. So he's just trialing different responses, and I'm taking it personally, saying, well, that's not the right response, you should know what I want, but of course he couldn't. And I was getting a few things wrong and causing myself and of course the horse a few problems. And I thought, if I'd have understood the science that I understand today back then, I'd have been much better. And I'd really like to avoid you wasting time getting things wrong when you could be doing a much better job. And that's why I'd like you to put a little bit of this science into your horsemanship, and I'm sure it'll help you along. So the use of pressure is one of the things that's really, really important, knowing how to use it and being precise about how to use it. There's basically three things when we're using pressure. The first is that it has to be an exclusive pressure. It has to be one pressure, one response. Whether it's in the horse's mouth, whether I'm using my legs, whether it's using pressure on the halter, whether it's teaching groundwork responses, I have one code, one cue to get one response. And if I decide that this means go backwards when I wiggle the lead rope, well, that means go backwards. It can't mean anything else now. If I decide that bilateral leg pressure means go forward, well, now it means go forward. It can't mean anything else. I couldn't use, for example, bilateral leg pressure to go forward and also to stop. And some people are doing things that they have some sort of biomechanical explanation. Well, I want the horse to engage in the stop and this and that. But if we take it right back to basics, there can only be one code for one response, or one cue for one response. I recently had a girl in a clinic, and she said, I'm having trouble with the brakes, I can't stop my horse. So I said, well, what do you do? She said, well, I shorten my reins and I sit into the saddle and I squeeze my legs. I said, what do you do when you want to go forward? And she said, well, I adjust my reins and I drive forward and I squeeze my legs. And I said, you know, I'm not sure that those two things can be separated. To me, they sound too close. So you're probably using the same button for two responses, and they're not just two responses, they're opposite responses. So you're using, it would be like if I said sit to my dog so that he came here, and sit so that he sat. I couldn't use the same word for both responses. And go and stop, it's even a little bit worse because they're opposites. So this poor girl's running into trouble with her horse because the horse couldn't possibly understand. She's using the same word for go and the same word for whoa, and the two aren't separable enough. So whether it would even be voice cues, you know, I know from working with dogs, you can't have voice cues that are too similar. They need to be exclusive. One word, one response. And you can't use one word for different responses. And it's really important, especially when we're using our hands. A lot of people riding horses, they're using their hands for direction. They're using their hands for impulsion, often here in Europe, holding the horse back. And they're also using their hands for the flexion, to get the horse to put his body into the right frame. Now, all that information in one mouth is a lot, and the horse can't possibly say, okay, that pressure means put myself into the right body position. That pressure means slow down. That pressure means sit down a little and get ready and that pressure means turn. So we really need to make sure, am I being strict about the first principle of pressure? Am I using one pressure for one response? Secondly, am I being progressive? So exclusive, and the next one is progressive. Am I starting with really light pressures and then building them up to where I get the response? So that progressively the horse knows what's going to happen before what happens, and I'm able to reduce those pressures to the smallest versions of themselves. I might even understand the whole conditioning process and be able to reduce the pressures to where I'm using signals that aren't actually aversive pressures. That would be Pavlovian conditioning, to where I'm just using a light signal, which might be a body weight transfer or something really, really subtle. And that's the goal of anyone in what, as we call over here in Europe, the equestrian art. We're all trying to obtain the same thing, is to get more and more from less and less. Now, that's not just some sort of idealist quest to be pretty or to have good dressage or to be a great equestrian or anything like that. It's also ethical. If we're getting responses from light pressures, we're being better to the horse. We're being nicer, kinder to the horse, because if we're getting light responses or nice responses from very light pressures, we're not inflicting pain upon our horses, and that would be pretty important. So am I able to use progressive pressures, but in the objective that those pressures get reduced to the smallest possible version of themselves? So exclusive, progressive, and the next thing with pressure that I'd be looking for would be the immediate release. It would be that looking for the timing in the removal of the pressure. And timing is such an important word. It really defines great horsemen from the rest, is that they have fabulous timing. They know how to use pressure, one response. They're progressive, and they're able to reduce the pressures, and they're able to release the pressure at exactly the right moment. And when we're using pressure, we're always trying to improve what we're doing. We've got always and forever with our horses two objectives, and those two objectives are, can I reduce the time of the response times? So could I get the responses a little quicker, a little snappier? And could I reduce the pressures necessary to get those responses? So I'm looking for two things: reducing the response time and reducing the pressure necessary to get the response. And if I'm getting fast responses, light responses from very little pressure, then I'm really on the right track. Now, I see a lot of people running down the wrong track, where they're starting to use bigger pressures and bigger pressures and bigger pressures. They've started the horse off in a halter or something, and now they've gone to a normal snaffle. Now that would be a normal progression, because one would hope that when they put the bit in the horse's mouth, that things are actually getting lighter, that the inside of the mouth would be more sensitive than the outside of the horse's nose, and maybe a little bit more precise, and they were able to use lighter pressures. Now if it was in that objective, that wouldn't be a problem. But then what happens is then people start to say, well, this bit isn't working, I'll get a bigger bit, and then a bigger bit. And now they're in these amazing contraptions with great bars down the side and all sorts of things hanging off them. And need to tie the horse's mouth shut, because now he's opening his mouth. And they're getting into this bigger bits syndrome. I need bigger spurs, bigger bits, more artillery, more mechanics. Now that means you're going down the wrong track. If we're using pressure correctly, what should be happening is the pressures are getting reduced. It's the goal of every horseman: do less, get more. So if you're having to do more and get less, you're probably on the wrong track. Now, how do people get this wrong? Well, I know here in Europe, watching a lot of riders, they know how to use the aids to get responses. So they're riding, they're using their legs, they're using their seat, they're using their hands, and they're getting responses from the horse. What they're actually doing is using the aids to get the response, but what they haven't done beforehand in the foundation phase is use the release or the removal of the aid to teach the response. Now that's the important part that's getting missed out a lot, is that people aren't fully understanding that it's the removal of the aid. Aid in French means help, but of course the horse isn't being helped by all these different pressures that you're using. The horse is getting more irritated, if anything, by those pressures. The only thing that really interests the horse when we're using our aids is, what can I do so that they stop? What can I do to remove the pressure of those legs? What can I do to remove the pressure of those hands? What can I do to remove the pressure of that whip? What can I do to remove the pressure of that halter? All he's really interested in is not responding correctly to the aid, but understanding how to remove it. And if you can help the horse by explaining with every little code, with every little pressure that you use, the correct response. Now, he won't know what the correct response is. He can only find that through trial and error. And the horse will trial different responses. And when he tries a good response, the pressure is removed and the horse says, okay, that response works for me. Does he profit or doesn't he profit? He profits or he doesn't from the right response. Now, if it's profiting the horse, if he profits from the good response, he'll do it again. It's not about you profiting from the horse being correct. It's about him profiting, that he finds, okay, I profit, I win, I found the way to remove the pressure from myself. Now I'll do that again. Next time I feel that pressure, that's the response. And if it's not the right response, then he can't profit from that. He needs to try again. And profit or profit me not, that's something that comes from way back in the 60s in Australia, where a great instructor used to use those terms simply to say, does it profit the horse or doesn't it? If it's not the right response, it mustn't profit the horse. If it is the right response, it absolutely must. Another analogy that he used that I thought was quite interesting at the time, and I'll share that with you, is that he was talking to his students and he said, if you sit on a nail, obviously, rather quickly, you'll stand back up again. Why do you stand up? And of course the students say, oh, because it hurts. He said, no, that's not why you stand up. Think about it. You sit on a nail and then suddenly you'll stand up fairly quickly. Why do you stand up? And again the people say, wow, because it hurts. No. And someone clicks, because it stops hurting. There we go. Now you need to be able to see things like this. The horse isn't responding to the aid, he's removing it. He's not trying to do the right thing or to help anyone out. He's just trying to find out, what can I do so that it stops? So it's the removal of the aid that's so important. And if all riders could just understand that basic principle, the basic principle of using pressure exclusively, one pressure, one response, being really sure that they're not using conflicting pressures. Sometimes riders are stopping the horse in front and pushing the horse forward from behind. Now we've got what we call opposing or conflicting pressures. That makes it pretty hard for the horse. He can't go forwards and stop at the same time. So if I'm doing the push me, pull you thing, and I'm blocking in front and I'm pushing behind and I'm trying to put the horse into a frame like that, the horse is probably going to develop conflict behaviors, and it would be one of the causes. It probably brings me, as far as our re-education stables here, probably brings in about 50% of the problems would be push me, pull you. Having horses blocked in front and pushed behind, with the theory that, well, I'll get the horse to round up by blocking him in front and pushing him from behind. And the horses get into this pressure situation where they absolutely can't find responses or any way of removing the pressure. So either they give up, they just become lazy cows and say, well, doesn't matter anyway, I can't remove those pressures, which is kind of sad. The horse becomes quite depressed, can develop different syndromes, problems, such as learned helplessness. That's something we'll talk about at another time, where the horse becomes quite depressed. Sometimes it can lead to the horse developing stereotypic behaviors. Sometimes they go a little bit mad and start to get some sort of neurosis. Because there's just all these pressures and there's lots of problems but no solutions. What the horse needs is to have the control of his environment, that every time there's a pressure comes on, he knows exactly how to remove it. If the horse feels like he's controlling his environment, he's just fine. And that's the case with any animal that feels that he can control his environment. Talk about operant conditioning or instrumental. If the animal is instrumental in his equitation, for example, if I'm riding my animal and I'm doing my French equitation over here, the animal needs to be an operator of the different pressures. Now, I might put the pressure on the horse, but he knows how to remove them. And so I'm feeling like I'm controlling my horse, but my horse is feeling like I'm controlling me. I'll say that again. If I'm getting it all right, I'm feeling like I'm controlling the horse, but the horse is feeling like he's controlling me, that he's removing the leg pressure, that he's removing the pressure from his mouth. So he's winning and I'm winning. And if you can get that win-win equitation happening, if all horses could find that win-win situation, I put the pressure on, the horse removes it, the horse is in control of his environment, he's not a victim of the situation, he's playing an active role. He's playing an active role in the equitation. And that would be something that would radically change the situation for a lot of horses. It would avoid the horses getting into situations where there's unavoidable pressures, where there's pressures that make no sense at all. A lot of riders think, yeah, but he knows, but of course the horse has got his head in the air and his mouth open and his eyes are blowing out of his head. He doesn't know. He wouldn't have that look on his head if he knew what to do. He's not doing that for the fun of it. So he's getting into confusion and he's blocked in front and he's being pushed from behind. It was one of the greatest ever French principles of equitation, hands without legs, legs without hands. Boucher was one of the legends of French equitation who talked about that. And it's really something that we need to uphold today, even though, that was back in the 1800s when he talked about that. And it's something that we need to hold in our equitation to this day, is to say, okay, let's not use conflictual or opposing pressures. It will drive the horse mad. If he doesn't just give up and get learned helplessness and go stale, he'll probably find a way of defending against the pressures that work. Either he'll buck or he'll rear or he'll duck out to the side, and he'll find a way of removing the pressures. And if it works, he'll do it again. He's not being naughty, he's just finding ways of removing pressures. The good response wasn't working for him, so he found another one, and that works just fine for him. He removes the pressure of the hand, he rears up, he removes the pressure of the hands, he removes the pressure of the legs, sometimes he removes the rider completely. Perfect, works well for him. Why not continue to do that? Does it profit him? Absolutely. So why not do it? So if the horse can't win by doing the good response, he's probably going to find another one. And I'll talk more about the whole win-win situation in another video. But if we're using the pressures correctly, then the horse can always be a winner. And the pressures can be reduced to tiny, tiny little versions of themselves, which might be pretty to look at, but above all, it's an ethical equitation. It's something that looks after the welfare of the horse. And that's certainly worth thinking about. So when you're using different pressures with your horse, does he know how to remove all those pressures? Are your pressures being reduced to the lightest versions of themselves? Are you applying pressure correctly? Are you lifting the pressures up correctly? Sometimes people put the pressure on and say, he's not responding. Well, do something about it. Lift the pressure. Oh, but I don't want to put the pressure on. Well, you'll have to, because if you don't, the horse is going to get desensitized. he's going to start, well, that pressure doesn't mean anything, so I can ignore it. If I'm holding my legs on all the time and not obtaining responses, the horse is just going to say, well, it's like the girth, isn't it? The pressure's always there, doesn't matter what I do, the pressure's never removed, so I can just ignore it. And now your horse is getting heavier and heavier. You say, oh, he's cold to the leg, he doesn't move off the leg, he's heavy off my legs, or he's got a dead mouth. You know, it wasn't dead till you killed it. So are we keeping light responses off our legs, light responses in our hands? Not because it's pretty, but because it's a welfare issue. It's kind to the horse. And are we getting all those pressures to the lightest versions of themselves? Are we getting the responses? Sometimes people want to be nice and they're using very light pressures, but they aren't getting the responses. You need to raise the pressure, get the response, remove the pressure, and continue until the very light pressure gets the light response. And always on that quest, eternal, always after the same thing, am I getting faster response times from lighter pressures? Am I getting more and more from less and less? Few ideas there to think about. Pressure is one of the most interesting things we can work with and really master how we use it. And I think the greatest horsemen, that's what really separates them from the others. They know how to use pressure and release. They know how to use one button for one response. They've got great timing. And that's what gives them that certain thing that often we call feeling. But before we can develop that, we have to understand what's going on in the horse's head and how can we help the horse understand how to remove these different pressures. Lots to think about, and I'll see you again in another video soon.